One thing, we have been very fortunate to have very good coverage by the Victoria Advocate for a number of years by Miss Melissa Carew here. And I want to point out, this is her last meeting this evening. She's moving on in life, so thank you for all the good work you've done. And we appreciate your efforts to understand city government and your reporting that you've done. So thank you very much. You're always welcome back, and I trust this article is going to be great. All right.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. Okay.
So John's got the next on quiet zones with railroad crossings.
Thank you. Mayor and members of council, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, we handed out to you a copy of this quiet zone evaluation report. And point a couple things out to you that should be in front of you at the dais. There's a hard copy of this presentation, and there's another handout that has this color-coded table that I'll refer to here later in this presentation. I want to remind you, take you back to November of last year when we contracted with Railroad Controls Limited to do this study. It was a project that was jointly funded by the city and the county of Victoria to evaluate 58 public road crossings, rail crossings, and 6 private crossings, basically all of the crossings that are at grade within the city limits and several just outside the city limits. The report itself includes an introduction with an overview of the quiet zone rules, an inventory of crossings and their existing warning systems, description of the quiet zone safety treatment options, what are called supplemental safety measures, and a summary of possible safety treatment options and order of magnitude costs for each crossing. It also has phasing options and a detailed crossing by crossing evaluation, which you'll find in Appendix B. Those are the large 11 by 17 sheets that make up the bulk of the document. That include, for each crossing, a location map, an aerial view of the crossing, photographs, descriptions, treatment options, and order of magnitude cost. And finally, the last page of the document is the phasing map in Appendix C. I want to start off by talking about the quiet zone rules, the regulation that was adopted by the Federal Railroad Administration, known as the train horn rule, became effective in June of 2005, and this rule requires train horns to be sounded while approaching every public roadway grade crossing. However, it allows for exceptions where safety measures can be installed to compensate for the absence of the sounding of a train horn. Therefore, basically the rule allows for the creation of designated quiet zones where the locomotive engineers are only required to sound the train horn in emergency situations. Please note, it does not say engineers are prohibited from sounding the train horn in a quiet zone. They are only required to sound the horn if there's an emergency situation. A vehicle gets into the intersection, a pedestrian is approaching the crossing. And there are 2 ways that you can go about creating a quiet zone, 2 processes that you can use. One is called public authority designation. The other is called public authority application. The public authority designation process is the preferred method. It's simpler, it's faster. Basically, if certain requirements are met, physical improvements requirements are met, Federal Railroad Administration approval is not required. And that is, those requirements are each crossing, every crossing within the quiet zone has to be equipped with an approved supplemental safety measure or a wayside horn. Also, the quiet zone risk index, which is a very complex set of calculations that I will not claim to understand or be able to do myself, has to be less than the nationwide significant risk threshold. What they're basically saying in a nutshell is you have to prove that the crossings within the quiet zone are actually safer than they were when the train was actually required to sound the horn. Okay, so you're actually having to build physical improvements that make it safer, that make it difficult or impossible for a vehicle to enter that intersection when a train is coming. The other process, public authority application, requires the approval of the FRA. The application process is required if any crossing within your quiet zone will not be equipped with an approved supplemental safety measure, or SSM, or a wayside horn. This method allows for alternative safety measures to be put in place of supplemental safety measures. In other words, the supplemental safety measures are pre-approved. If you design it to meet the standards, the specifications that are required by the train horn rule, it's considered to be approved. If it's a supplemental safety measure, and we're going to go through those tonight. An alternative safety measure it is basically something that takes the place of one of those SSMs. For example, if you physically cannot put in a median that's long enough to meet, or that would be allowable under the rule, you could apply for an alternative safety method that would basically provide a shorter median. So if the minimum requirement's 60 feet, you can only do 40. You can apply for an alternative safety measure, but you have to meet some additional standards. If you're going to go this route through the application process, you have to provide effectiveness rates, establish effectiveness rates for all of your alternative safety measures. That requires a significant amount of monitoring before even submitting your application, and the process takes significantly longer. There's additional notice requirements, additional involvement by the railroad, whether it's UP or KCS, and again, it requires final approval by the Federal Railroad Administration. And the risk there is the city is likely to be scrutinized later if there's an accident at one of those intersections where you didn't provide a supplemental safety measure. So those are the processes. Again, the first option is preferable, but there are going to be situations where you simply either can't physically make those improvements, or there may be other factors to cause you to go the application route. Real quickly, I want to cover kind of a summary of rail operations in Victoria. There are 5 rail subdivisions that cross Victoria, and they're all covered on this slide here. They're also in a map in the document. I'm not going to go over them, but it's just an overview of how many trains and how many crossings each of those subdivisions contains. What I want to focus on is the safety measures, the options for supplemental safety measures, and go over each of those. First option, 4-quadrant gate system, probably the most effective supplemental safety measure, also the most expensive. SSM is a 4-quadrant gate system. Basically, with these systems, all approach and exit lanes on both sides of the rail crossing are spanned by gates. Typically, you'll have at least 2 gates, one on each side of the road, one set on each side of the tracks, to physically prevent a vehicle from entering that crossing once the bells sound and those gates are lowered. One of the other requirements for this SSM is you have to have constant warning time circuitry and power out indicators at these intersections. You're going to note that that's going to be a requirement on every one of these supplemental safety measures. And the order of magnitude cost for this type of crossing is about $250,000 per crossing.
Now, if there's already a set of gates there, you only had to add 2 more, or you have to replace the whole thing?
It's going to be up to the railroad company, and it's going to be a different answer probably on every intersection, because they're going to look at how old are these gates? Are they going to need to be replaced in the next so many years, whatever their particular standard is? How old is my continuous safety circuitry? Does it need to be rewired? If they determine that their equipment's kind of old and they'd like to have it replaced, you're going to replace it. It's not their idea to do the quiet zone, it's ours. So and I'm going to cover that in a little bit later when we talk about costs a little more. Yes,
And the
sir.
maintenance is the railroad's though?
On some of it. Some of these improvements, the maintenance is our responsibility. Now, things that are within the railroad right-of-way, I believe the answer is they would maintain it. But some of these improvements are actually outside of the right-of-way, and it's not their not their problem. And I'm going to cover a little bit more about some of those question marks, and because these prices are going to vary wildly. The next option, which is the one that we implemented in our current quiet zone at Ben Wilson and Del Mar and now John Stockbauer, is to use gates with medians or channelization devices. If you have an existing gate, an existing signal and gate arms, one of the options is to install a median or use delineators, or what we call channelization devices, to again provide that physical barrier to keep a car from going around those railroad gates. Those medians or delineators need to extend at least 100 feet from the gate arms on both sides of the rail crossing, unless there's an intersection in 100 feet, and then in that case the medians or delineators have to extend at least 60 feet, and that is the minimum. If within 60 feet of the gate arms there are any intersections, including an intersection with a commercial driveway or a public street, those intersections have to be closed, permanently closed or relocated in order to use this safety measure. So what you're going to find as you go through this in more detail is that's the reason that a lot of the intersections where we're recommending another more expensive supplemental safety measure, that's the reason we're recommending it, because this one is not available to us unless you go the application route and do alternative safety measures, which at this point in time we're not recommending. Again, the circuitry has to be there. The cost varies a great deal depending on the intersection. Best case, you have signals and lights that are all in good working order. All the circuitry is there. All you have to do is go in and install that barrier, and you use delineators, $20,000. You decide to put in a raised concrete median, it's going to be a little more expensive. If you need to put in the gates, the traffic or the rail signal to start with, or if that intersection does not have the safety circuitry, you're looking at, again, back up to over $200,000. So every intersection is going to be different. Another thing, if our personal preference when it comes to these safety measures would be raised medians as opposed to the delineators. Yes, it's more expensive, but the delineators are easily broken. You have to go back frequently and monitor those and replace those missing parts. And if you are curious about that, just drive by down Loop 463 in front of Citizens Medical Center, and you'll get an idea of how easily those things disappear. The next option, we're actually not recommending one of these, but I want to put it out there as an option that we considered, and that is to convert a two-way street to a one-way street. In order to save the cost of adding those additional gate arms. You'll only need two gates. You just install them both on the same side of the railroad track for a one-way street. We're not recommending any. We actually looked at a large number of crossings to see if there were any where it would make sense to convert the street to one way, or maybe two crossings that are a block apart create a one-way pair, because it would be a lot less expensive than the other options in those locations. It just didn't make sense anywhere. We looked at a bunch of them, and for other reasons, traffic circulation reasons in those neighborhoods, the one-way conversion just was not the best option. And finally, you can close a street. Permanent street closure is an option. Obviously, it's an inexpensive option, not always a popular option, but it is a possibility. Council, as you know, has already decided to close 3 rail crossings at Sabine, Guadalupe, and Staten. And at this time, we're not recommending additional closures, but as we go through this and we look at some of the potential quiet zone phases, especially those that have, 10, 15 crossings in a quiet zone, all in a row, a block apart from one another, we would probably go back and reconsider that possibility and look at additional closures that could be considered. So,
John, I have a
Yes, sir.
question. Obviously, it talked about the permanent signage and barricades. Looking at the slide that you had back there, what's the possibility of, from an aesthetic standpoint, putting a curb in and putting grass there versus a sign that's litters Main Street or whatever, going down and seeing sign after sign, or barricade after barricade after barricade?
Right.
Permanent, that's not going anywhere, but just adds to the,
It depends on it depends on the situation. If you'll think about those along Main Street that are already closed, we did them both ways. The one that's further north, closer to Red River, you'll notice that we actually removed the street and put in curb and gutter because there was nothing there. There was no other land
actually, I
that-
don't
that
notice it.
took
because there's not a
access.
Barricade there.
I'm sorry?
Said, actually, I don't notice it because there's not a barricade there.
The barricade's only on the other side of the track. That's right. If you come further south, there's and I don't remember which street it is. I believe it's the first one just north of Rio Grande. There is a barricade because there's properties that gain access off of that street, and we needed to leave it there for that access. So every one of them will have to be looked at individually.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. And the final safety measure that we'll talk about is wayside horns. A wayside horn system is a stationary system that's actually mounted on or near the signal, and it has individual horns that are directed at approaching vehicular traffic. So as opposed to the train horn that projects up and down the rail, the wayside horns project perpendicular to the rail and are directed toward the traffic that needs to hear them. It's technically not a supplemental safety measure because the FRA considers the wayside horn system to be a one-for-one substitute for the train horn. They have to provide a sound level of over 92 decibels measured 100 feet from the track. They must sound at least 15 seconds prior to the train's arrival at the crossing or at the same time that the flashing lights begin and the gates descend. Again, obviously the crossing has to have gates, flashing lights, constant warning time circuitry, and power out indicators. There's also an additional requirement with wayside horns that the railroad has to adopt an operating rule for each crossing where there is a wayside horn. And the order of magnitude cost for these installations is about $120,000 per crossing. The obvious question that is begged here is if the point of a quiet zone is to make it quiet, why are you going to replace one horn with another? And I think the next few slides will demonstrate why that is. The next several graphics that I'm going to show you provide sound contours to compare the amount of sound created or generated by the train horn versus a wayside horn. And in these graphics, the red shading is going to represent sound levels of 90 decibels or greater. The blue represents sound levels between 80 and 90 decibels. This first example is the Nursery Drive crossing out in front of Springwood along Highway 87. And again, those sound contours on this graphic represent the sound of the train horn at that particular crossing. This graphic shows sound contours for the wayside horns. Let me back up. Train horn, and you can look at the extent of those neighborhoods and businesses on either side of the track that are impacted by those levels, 80 to 90 and above decibels of sound, compared to the wayside horn, which is directed, again, straight at the traffic that needs to hear it and not so much up and down the track.
So the red is the wayside horn?
Both of these colors, the red is over 90 decibels, the blue is 80 to 90 decibels. This is the train horn, red and blue. This is the wayside horn. The red is so small on this graphic you can't see it up on the screen, but if in the original paper document you can see much better. Another example, this is the Convent Street crossing near Water Street on the southeast side of downtown. These are the sound contours for the train horn for that particular crossing. Sound contours for the wayside horn, again, only impacting a handful of homes on either side of the track. Keeping in mind that that's just for the horn sounding for this intersection, and in this location, you've got intersection after intersection after intersection, so you can extend that red up and down that rail line about as far as you want to, and you'll still be in that contour. So obviously, the answer is, yes, it still makes noise. If you happen to be the person that lives in that first house right off the railroad tracks, you're still going to hear the horn, but you're hearing it anyway. And the rest of the folks that maybe you're a block or two off or further down the track, they're not going to be impacted by the wayside horn as they are by the train horn. And as you know, as many blocks away, you can hear those train horns. Okay, those are the optional safety measures. The next part of your document or of the report is the field reviews that RCL completed at every grade, at-grade crossing. That's, again, the data that you find in Appendix B. For every crossing, you'll find a location map, an aerial. Photographs that were taken at ground level, description of existing conditions at each of those crossings, so it'll inventory the safety equipment, whether there are lights, gates, signage, etc. And also shows the distance from any street or the nearest street or driveway intersections and the order of magnitude cost for safety treatments. And again, those are those 11 by 17 sheets that you have in that packet, one for every crossing. And that's what they look like. So I've been using this term order of magnitude cost, and I use it because the consultant prefers to use that terminology. We don't want to give the impression that these cost figures that we're using are actual detailed estimates, cost estimates. They're not. They're not based on these specific crossings. Each crossing is going to be different, and each safety treatment is going to be different depending on which railroad company you're working with, depending on how wide the street is, the type, age, and condition of the existing safety equipment. Again, from one crossing to the next, you could be using the same supplemental safety measure and it be vastly different in cost depending on what's there today. So this order of magnitude is just to give you a kind of a comparative idea of generally how much more is it to have to put in a 4-quadrant gate than it is to put up a median. And how much would this phase of a quiet zone generally compare to this phase? And that's really all we can do at this point. So it's based on average cost. To do crossing-specific cost estimates on that level of detail is well beyond the scope of this evaluation. In fact, any of the portions of modifications that would have to be done within the railroad right-of-way, like modifications to signals, upgrading circuitry, and so on, would have to be done and provided by UP or KCS. So, with that caveat in mind, that limitation in mind, the rough estimate ballpark to implement quiet zones throughout all rail lines in the city, about $6.5 million. Obviously, we don't have $6.5 million laying around in our CIP for projects, so we asked the consultant to look at the possibility of phasing quiet zones, and so we asked him to do this following part of the plan, which is identify multiple smaller quiet zone phases that could be prioritized and implemented over a period of time. In order to do that, you need to know what the limitations are. A quiet zone has to be at least a half-mile long. You can do a quiet zone that only includes one crossing, but if there's another crossing within a quarter mile, it has to be included. And a quiet zone has to begin and end at a public crossing. You can't begin or end a quiet zone at a private rail crossing. So based on those requirements, RCL developed a list of potential phases, color-coded tables that begin on page 17 of the report show how quiet zones could be grouped into phases. I handed out in front of you this additional or newer version of that table. The difference is it breaks it down by cost. It tells you how much each of those phases are relative to one another, whereas the table in the original document doesn't do that. It just breaks them out into phases. And we're going to go over some of those real quick. The first few are relatively small. You could actually do a small one crossing quiet zone at Tropical Drive out on Highway 87, across from the West High School. Moving down the line, you've actually got one section that is the loop and loop frontage roads that technically already meets the standards for quiet zones because the frontage roads are one way. And the main lanes are grade separated. Now, does that mean you should go out there tomorrow and designate that as a quiet zone? I don't think it's worth the paperwork and time it would take to do that unless you're going to do more than just designate it, because that didn't help anybody. You have a rail crossing, you have a horn blowing at Tropical and one at Springwood. It doesn't do you much good to not have a horn blowing at the loop. So, but you could include it with either one of those and significantly increase the length of your quiet zone because it's kind of a freebie. I'm not going to go through all these other than to point out that there are several small, relatively small sections that could be standalone phases. You could combine any two or more adjacent phases. You can't split them. Okay, you can't stop where these tables are broken out from one to the next. You have to do that entire table as a quiet zone. You can't split them like this one. This is the first really big one that starts up at Red River Street and goes all the way down through downtown and around to the east side of downtown. It's about a $1.4 million project to get that one done. There's another one as you go out further on that same line, on the Clutta Creek line, another $1.2 or $3 million. So again, each of those has to be complete. You can't stop halfway through and call it a quiet zone because there's another crossing within a quarter mile, in most cases about a block, a block or two.
Can't jump one?
I'm sorry?
Can't jump one?
If it's within a quarter mile, the answer is no. And that's how that's how we split these out into phases, is if there's another crossing within a quarter mile, you keep going until you get to a place where you have a gap. And that's what these represent.
But John, you can do, like in this case, go back a couple of slides. You can do, I want to get my colors right. You can do red and skip to green if you want to. You don't
You
have to
could.
do red, blue, and green.
That's correct.
So
That's-
I'm not
they
sure
are
if that's what
They
you were
could be
asking.
standalone, each one of
No,
them,
in
and you
each
can skip
matrix,
them.
you've listed one or more, but if you didn't want to do one in that matrix, you can't do that.
You can't do
That's
that,
correct.
no. You
That's correct.
can't pull anything out, but you can skip, you
Including
know.
the private drives?
That's correct. And those are dealt with individually. Has to be, whatever improvements are going to be put in those private crossings have to be negotiated with that private property owner and worked out with the railroad. So we don't have any idea what the cost of those would be, and that's the other kind of,
But you can't jump
Asterisk.
those if they're in the matrix.
they have to be included. Now, they may not require as much work because especially some of them are totally controlled by the company that owns property on both sides. They're probably not going to have that stringent of a requirement with the rail company, whereas if it's a private driveway across the railroad onto a private highway, onto a public highway, it's going to be probably going to be a different animal. So it depends on what kind of traffic it is. So again, each one of these could be individual, or you could group them. And I'm not going to go through them all. I just wanted to refer you to them. All those tables are in this handout, which also has a smaller version of that map. The color codes actually correspond to that phasing map that's on the very back of the quiet zone evaluation.
You've also included the out-of-city limit.
A few of them, yes,
Right.
sir. Those that were included in the study. We didn't go way out, but for example, if on this particular slide, if this is the Rosenberg line, the KCS line, as you go past Loop 463, that transitions from UP to KCS. As you go out that line, the railroad crosses the city limit line several times. So several of these crossings are in the city limits, and several of them are outside the city limits. And so that one's kind of a hybrid that would require a joint application by the city and the county. And then there was another one back a few slides, this brown-colored header is part of that Coletta Creek line. After you exit the city limits going south, all three of those are outside the city limits, and actually all three of those are very complicated to do quiet zones for. But that's all I had to share with you tonight. Wanted to just do an overview and give you an opportunity to ask questions or invite you to follow up with me if you have questions that I can answer in the future. But again, none of these projects are in our CIP, but we have a tool now to go to that gives us a really good idea of what it will take to do a quiet zone in any given location in town.
The mayor's YouTube, can you
Oh,
wanna play
yes.
that now?
I think
I
James
just
has a
suggested
video.
this might be helpful as an example of the
Wayside Horn.
wayside horn, excuse me.
Maybe not.
Do you need us to blow like a train horn?
It worked earlier.
It was ready.
At least one thing, you don't have the Doppler effect.
In the meantime, I can answer
Coming at you and
questions.
Going away from you, that's called Doppler effect. That's how they do radar.
That's okay if you can't get it. I would just suggest council members and the public, if they want to go to YouTube and look, that's what I did this morning, and there's some really good examples. That one in particular was one I suggested of how they work. Really neat. I think they're
I can tell you I was skeptical. When the first draft of the report came back and recommended a
Uh-oh.
bunch of wayside horns, that's why we
Here we
worked
go.
real close with a consultant to look at those contours. Thank you, James.
Wayside horn is gonna be consistent and not dependent on the engineer blowing, because I
Yeah,
know
it'll be
that's
the
one of the
same every
things
time.
that, Mr. Alvarez has brought up before. It seemed dependent on the engineer.
They're up at 2 in the morning, they want everybody up.
All right. That's all I have, unless you have any other questions.
Really good report. This is an outstanding report. in
They
my
did a very
opinion.
nice job.
The way it was presented, it's easy to understand, so.
It is.
I guess it's incumbent upon council to request or discuss for parts of this for the CIP for the future, or staff could always bring a recommendation. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So last but not least.
Well, I want to thank the TxDOT people here for waiting. I thank you. Our meetings don't normally go this long.
Good evening. So TxDOT is proposing or considering a median project constructing raised medians on Navarro. This would be between Loop 463 and Mockingbird. And I'll also point out that this was a project that was identified in the MPO's long-range plan that was recently adopted in April. So this presentation that we're about to hear was also given to the MPO committee in April. And it's really a means to inform the public of what TxDOT's considering, get public input, and provide some general information on medians. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, who is Bill Frawley from the Texas A&M Transportation Institute.
Good evening. If you see a really big smile on my face, it's because I got some messages and I had to step out. I was supposed to also, from here, drive to Belton tonight to be at a work session there tomorrow for something, and that got canceled. So I get to spend a night here in beautiful Victoria.
Wonderful.
Instead of going, yes, and I will hit the barbecue trail at least once. So, but my name is Bill Frawley. I'm with the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, or TTI, as some people may have known it. A couple things, and I'm going to be quick, but I don't want to rush through it, but I want to respect your time. I know it's late and everything. But if you have any questions along the way with the slides or anything, please feel free just at that point say, hey, I want to ask a question, get clarification. There is a little bit of technical information. Some of it's just sort of principles and ideas of these things. But before I get started on that, one thing, Mr. Kaminsky's presentation on the quiet crossings, I live in Arlington. That's where my office is. They did those recently in Arlington a few years ago. Our office sits exactly at a railroad crossing. It's wonderful. They went with the raised median option there. And I'll tell you, we don't have people ducking around the gates anymore. And it's quieter also anyway. And that's just Bill Frawley speaking, not TTI, just for clarification. Another thing, the reason I'm able to be here is you'll see on the slide, in cooperation with TxDOT, we are part of the Texas A&M University system at TTI. But we have an interagency contract with TxDOT where they allow us to go to help TxDOT districts, MPOs, and other agencies around the state as needed to do things. And one of the emphasis areas is access management, which includes raised medians. We also assist MPOs with some very technical things. And with that, I'm going to take just one moment to say that I've had contact with all 25 MPOs in Texas over the last 22 years I've worked with TTI. Some of them I've worked with extensively. You're very blessed to have Mary Craighead as your MPO director. And she didn't know I was going to say this, so she turns red, or redder than I am. But believe me, I have worked with many MPO directors, some that are new, some that have been there a while, and you're very blessed. You're in good hands with her. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and go into my presentation. Three things I want you to be thinking about as I talk about these things. And one of the reasons we do this is safety with raised medians and other access management tools. Another one is for mobility purposes. And another one is to make those two things happen, sometimes we have to physically prevent a maneuver that can end up being hazardous to all drivers. And for instance, and I'll get into that here in a little bit, but a professor that I had in both undergrad and graduate school at A&M back in the 80s said, if you want to physically prevent a driver from doing something, or to prevent them from doing it, you have to physically make it impossible, not just put a sign up. And I'll tell a story on myself in that'll bring it home here in just a few minutes. But basically, access management overall is a set of tools to help improve safety and mobility on the roadways, and it also helps protect the public investment that we've all made in the roadway system. It balances access to developed land, because we have to be able to get in and out of businesses and homes and other developments, with traffic mobility along the roadway. And then it works with what's called functional classification, that being like arterials and collectors and so on. Those terms may be familiar with you if you've ended up working with the arterial or thoroughfare plan and so on. And another key thing to point out is it's not one size fits all. So what works in San Angelo or Odessa or Tyler or Houston may not work in Victoria. What works on one street in Victoria may not work on another street in Victoria. So it's not just to come in and say, this is great, this is a cookie cutter, do it because it's been good everywhere else. Again, I want to acknowledge TxDOT Transportation Planning and Programming Division, the TxDOT Yoakum District, the Victoria office, and the MPO staff. They've all worked together to bring this thing to fruition, and then to make it possible for me to come share years of research and years of experience that I've been working with these things. And to let you know, first 3 years of my career, I worked for local government in Florida. I did land use planning, zoning, then started an MPO. So I do have a really good understanding of what it's like to be in the local government shoes with these things happening. Okay, so when would you consider a raised median and why would you do that? Basically, raised medians play a critical role in the operations and safety of a roadway when, okay, you remember Jeff Foxworthy did that whole, you might be a redneck if? Well, you might need a raised median if, okay? So if you have volumes on your roadway in 20,000 or more per day, you might need a raised median. If you have multi-lane roadways with a high level of pedestrian activity, people trying to cross the streets, you might need a raised median. If you have high crash locations where it's desirable to limit left turns or to improve safety, then you might need a raised median. If you have all of these things, you definitely need a raised median, most likely. Now, the research that I've done and that other agencies have done around the country are all very consistent. Crash volume and rate reductions are one of the biggest findings when you have raised medians. And again, we're talking about streets that get over 20,000, usually 25,000, or you know they will get there. And this stretch of Navarro Road has those volumes already. Crash severity is reduced, not only the number of crashes and the rates, but the severity of crashes. And we're talking like side impact, sometimes we'll call T-bone crashes, head-on, near head-on, and so on, where you see the highest rates of fatalities, serious injuries, and so on. All right, this table is in here. Let me just point out one thing. I'm not going to go through every number. If you look in the upper left hand, you'll see where it says total access points per mile, and that says less than 20. That's driveways and intersections, okay? And then it says if it's an undivided roadway, 3.8, that's number of crashes per million vehicle miles traveled. In other words, it's just a way to normalize things and say, what do we expect in terms of crashes? So if you look to the upper right hand where it says non-traversable median, that can be a raised median, a grassy depressed median, whatever, and you have fewer than 20 access points per mile, you'll see you can expect about 2.9 crashes per million vehicle miles traveled. You go to the complete opposite down in the lower left-hand corner, undivided roadway where you have no center left turn lane even, just the opposite lanes are right up against each other, and a high driveway access point ratio or density, you more than triple your expectancy of crashes. And then you can kind of look and see if you just change the medians or just change the driveway density, how that works. This is a four-leg intersection diagram, and for simplicity, there's one direction of travel in each direction, one lane of travel. There's 32 what we call conflict points in this intersection, opportunities for vehicle paths to cross. And you'll see in the middle, you have the most severe by the little shapes over here where you have crossing maneuvers, not just merging or diverging. That's where you have the chances for the side impact, head-on, near head-on, the most severe crashes usually. If you go to a three-leg intersection, you can see you go from 32 conflict points down to 9 because you've reduced a lot of the left turn capabilities. And if you basically then have two opposing three-leg intersections because you have a raised median or some other divider, you've gone to 4 conflict points, basically because you've removed the left turn capabilities. All right, so this is something to kind of put yourself in the driver's seat, so to speak. And I promise the people of Tyler I won't tell them where I took these pictures, but let's just assume you're the driver of this Suburban or SUV, and you're wanting to make the left turn out of this driveway. We've all been in this situation. You've got 7 lanes, it could even be 5, but you have 3 lanes each direction plus that center left turn lane. And what did they always teach us in driver's ed? You look left, then right, then left again, because the vehicle on the left's going to nail you before the one on the right. So with these high volumes of traffic in each direction, you look left, and you wait for what we would call in the transportation world that acceptable gap. In other words, when can I dart out and not get hit? At the same time, you're trying to balance it with the other direction of travel, unless you have that center left turn lane, in which case you might just focus on the people coming from your left. Then you get out into the left turn lane, and you kind of have that, okay, made it that far, it's a safe haven. But what do we start doing when we're in that left turn lane? We look over our shoulder, and we look for that other acceptable gap, and sometimes someone's doing the opposite thing from the other direction. They're looking over their shoulder, and unfortunately, this is what can happen, And that literally was just down the road from the other picture. And I'm not a lawyer, and no offense to any attorneys, but I did chase the ambulance to go see what was happening, and this is what happened. And it's unfortunate, but it makes a good point of that's why and they have since put a raised median down this roadway. This is what we're trying to prevent. So, another thing that comes up, if I've talked about safety enough, if you have any questions, let me know, but emphasize the safety point. One of the next things that comes up, the business owners, the community will say, hey, if people can't make as many left turns or left turn as easily into my business, that's going to hurt me. If they have to go down and make a U-turn or do a round the block kind of thing. And that's an understandable concern, and TxDOT has spent money for us to research that over different years. And what we have found out, consistent with agencies in other parts of the country, looking at similar types of things, is that overall, when a raised median is installed, retail sales are pretty much the same compared to, or before and after, okay? And then as well as the customers saying, what's the likelihood of them to return to those businesses? Pretty much the same. You know, there's a few things, if it's a fast food or a gas station, I'm going to pop in what's convenient unless it's, you know, I've got little kids and they have to go to the Golden Arches or whatever their favorite might be. But there are a lot of other factors that contribute to whether a business succeeds or not. Now, something else that goes into the success of businesses, this little blob diagram shows you two different market areas. The tighter one is if the average speed on the streets is 30 miles per hour. You'll see the arrow, you see the little dash line. That's basically for just X number of minutes to get somewhere. That's that business's market area in the center. If the traffic can flow at a greater speed, like 45 miles an hour, the same travel time is expanded out to the more solid line. So in other words, by improving traffic flow, you've increased that business's market area, if that makes sense. And this is something that actually comes out of a textbook and a guidebook from the Institute of Transportation Engineers. So, in terms of infrastructure investment protection, again, I mentioned early on, one of the things is we're trying to protect the taxpayer dollars that are being spent out here. There's a lot of relatively low-cost treatments that can be done. There's, and one of the things you can do is minimize the need for parallel or widened roads. So in other words, when you talk about your CIP and how are we going to get more vehicles down the roadway, or what do we do about this? Well, sometimes instead of adding lanes or adding another parallel roadway and then another one, you can regain some of the capacity or maintain the capacity by doing some of these things, including raised medians and including, at some point, if you want to consider it, driveway density issues. But a large part of this is trying to minimize the stop and go or stop and slow traffic that can happen with people entering from the right-hand side or the left-hand side out of this center left turn lane. Some other things, just so you know, there's other options that are out there in the world. Auxiliary lanes, alternate left turn treatments, and so on. I'm not going to belabor those because we're really focusing on the, I'll answer any questions if you want and hang around afterwards and talk to you, especially since I don't have to drive to Belton. No, I'd stay anyway. I want to go through a couple of case studies because, and a lot of times I know what will happen. I've been all over the state and I've been to other states in the country, and when I'll talk about these things, and I'm not here as a salesman trying to tell you, you know, this is the thing to do. I'm just going to share this information with you. But I know one of the things that comes up also is, well, this is Victoria. I'm glad that worked in Odessa or Arlington or wherever, but this, and I've been to Arlington, where I live, went to the city council to talk about this when they said, well, I'm glad that worked over in that part of Arlington, but what about this part? So I understand. But there's a lot of things that are common results out of these. All right, in Arlington, Cooper Street, FM 157, there was about 7 miles actually going into the city of Mansfield also. Lots of crashes, very high volumes. In some parts, lower volumes where the roadway and the land weren't as developed as much yet. But the city council expressed some concerns about having raised medians put in because they knew some of the business owners were concerned. And one city council person, when I was doing a presentation somewhat like this, because TxDOT was going to use safety money to do one there, said, hey, I just don't want to see this section of Arlington become an economic ghetto with boarded up windows because businesses go away. And I said, I understand that concern, but it won't happen, and it didn't happen. In fact, in the last couple of years, they've actually requested, the city council have gone to TxDOT and said, please extend the raised medians beyond the corridor that you've already done. We didn't see any negative impacts on the businesses. We've seen positive impacts on traffic flow and the safety issues. So that's a case, and there's other examples also, but where there was concern at first, the realization came around locally, and it worked out okay. Corpus Christi, kind of your neighbors just about 90 or 100 miles to the southwest. They've added some raised medians and something called loons, which is not just a crazy person that gets up and shows you pictures on the screens, but this is a semi-technical term where if you don't have enough right-of-way or lanes to make a U-turn in even like a large SUV, you can just kind of cut out into the, in your own right-of-way, but you can kind of cut out on the side of the road so that a vehicle can make that U-turn where they normally wouldn't be able to in just 2 lanes of traffic. So just a little hint there to, in case you have some roads ever in the future, this is kind of progressive for Texas, and Corpus Christi, the city, and TxDOT got together on that, so.
Excuse me,
Yes,
can you
please.
point that out a little more clearly?
Yeah,
'Cause
I'm sorry.
It looks like just an intersection.
And I'm gonna, okay. So we'll just say this is northbound where you have the white SUV, and this is southbound. So there's a signalized intersection up here, okay? And to make, when they put the raised median in, they wanted to have openings every so often to lessen the amount of security or frequency, increase the frequency of being able to access businesses. So there's a median opening right here. This pickup truck can't make that U-turn in only 2 lanes width of traffic, okay? Now, in the little Yugo or Ford Fiesta, you might be able to do that with the shorter wheelbase. So by cutting out into this grassy area along the side of the roadway, an existing right-of-way, and paving it, it makes it to where that pickup truck can make that U-turn without jumping the curb and slowing down traffic and that type of
Go
thing.
back a slide, I think it was the cutout, the left turn up the top screen. So they would be taking that left and then making the U-turn.
Correct, yes. Does that help answer the questions? Okay, all right. Okay, so what have raised medians done for Navarro Road? There's already a segment of Navarro Road that has raised medians. They were done, I'm thinking 10 years or so, maybe more ago. They've been there for a while. Well, you never know how many crashes you've prevented, okay? But there's a good history along that segment of roadway with low numbers and rates of crashes and resulting incapacitating injuries. We've looked at the crash data and stuff, and it's really one of the better segments that we've seen. We didn't have the before data to compare because it's so long ago, but you can tell by the, quote, after data, there's very few crashes and a low crash rate. One of the things here that I want to emphasize too then is easing the driver's workload. With fewer conflict points, the driver has a better set of expectations going down the roadway. Fewer surprises of that vehicle coming out of that left turn lane at any given point when they're accelerating or popping all the way across from somewhere you can't really see. And I'll explain something here quickly. I have a 15-year-old son who has his learner's permit. And I have gone from, this kind of passenger with him too. But I want the whole transportation network to be as easy for him as possible, as easy for me. I mean, recently I turned 40. More recently I turned 50, okay? But I want it easy for me. I have an 83-year-old father. We've had to take his driving privileges away from him, okay? He doesn't need to be out there. But a year or two ago, doing this kind of thing with his neck slowly, we need the driving experience to be as easy as possible. So that's one of these things that can help in terms of when you're driving down the roadway, better expectations of where opposing or conflicting traffic maneuvers will be coming from. What will raised medians do for the next segment of Navarro Road? You're kind of fortunate. There's not a horrible crash history to date. We've looked at the last few years of crash data. There have been some incapacitating injuries. We haven't noticed any fatalities. But there will be a continuance of benefits that were identified in the previous segment. You can expect to see the lower crash rates, fewer incapacitating injuries, and so on. And so one of my last points here, let me say this and I'll tell you. It's important to look at the entire corridor also, some other considerations. In other words, if we're thinking about putting in a raised median, and this is something that TxDOT is very good at, They're looking at what else is going on adjacent roadways and intersections so that we're not just saying, okay, right here, we don't want people making left turns. Well, how does that affect other things? And that's part of this whole process as well. All right, so there's my contact information. The last thing I'll tell you, and this goes back to the whole, if you don't want someone to make a maneuver that's hazardous, you've got to physically make it impossible. Where I live in Arlington, come out of my neighborhood, you can make a left turn through a median opening. To the right, it's a very steep hill. To the left, you can see everything coming. If you're in a pickup truck or an SUV, you can see over the hill to the signalized intersection, but there's a blind spot. You have to count like to 3 because you'll miss a car that's coming up. So one day, after I've lived there for quite a few years, one day after my kids are born, I'm driving to church on Sunday morning and make that left-hand turn. We're almost to the church, and one of the little boys says, "Daddy, what does it mean when there's a sign with a left arrow and a circle around it and a slash mark through it?" And I said, "Well, my little young impressionable mind, that means you're not supposed to make a left turn there. Why would you ask this?" Because there was one of those back there where you made the left turn. Point being, I'd become so comfortable myself making that turn because I could look up and over the hill and I knew to count, but we're making it possible for other drivers, whether it's their first time through that intersection or their 5th or their 15-year-old driver or an 83-year-old driver or a 50-year-old driver. We've got to make it as safe as possible. And so now I go through the neighborhood and don't do that anymore. Be a good role model for the kids. Are there any questions? And yes, sir.
Initially, it was recommended to go all the way to Airline, and now it's stopping at Mockingbird. Can you give me any illumination on that?
I don't have that information. That would have to come from TxDOT most likely, and I don't know that they're here tonight, but we can make sure that that answer gets back to you. That's got to be something to do with the scoping or the phasing of the project. I'm just kind of the, here's how good it's going to be guy, so to speak. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Bill, I actually had a
Yes.
question, and you probably don't have the information as we speak, but you talked about decreased crash rates where the medians are up on the north side of Navarro, and in comparing them to where we are now, I'd like to see, I mean, even though it's a separate area,
Sure.
but there's still such a large volume of traffic that flows across there. I'd like to see what's the difference, what's the significance.
Okay. I'll see if we can, I'm sorry.
It's probably been 2 or 3 years that they report that to the MPO,
Okay.
and it was greatly reduced. It's maybe more than that. It's been a while.
Well, I'd like to see some
Yeah,
statistical difference.
it is interesting information. It was more dramatic out near the mall.
Okay. Okay.
That wasn't me.
Oh, who's speaking, I'm sorry?
As far as I know, it wasn't me.
I just want to make a few comments, just for clarification, and your presentation is great.
Okay.
We, again, appreciate you waiting and being patient.
No problem.
But for the public, Navarro is TxDOT. It's not a city road. We don't maintain it. We don't work on it. This is, and Mr. Halpaska is on the MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization,
As
and
is
also
Councilman Alvarez.
Mr. Alvarez. And this is the number 3 recommendation on y'all's list of projects, which of course y'all develop in conjunction with TxDOT staff, correct? Okay, and it is TxDOT's belief that this would improve things, and I want to make it clear also, it's their decision, short of this body probably overwhelmingly saying no to medians. That's a correct statement? So, you know, and I'm not in opposition to this. I think it's very interesting and a good project for the most part, but obviously TxDOT will allow plenty of public comment and property owners up and down there and business owners to be part of the whole design process, hopefully. And
Yes, and I will actually commend TxDOT. As I'm seeing it more statewide over the last 20 years, taking a new approach at public involvement on these types of things where they come out with what you call almost a blank slate or an aerial photo without any drawings of what it's going to be, and then saying to the public, come mark up here where you would like to see an opening or where you would like to see, so that it doesn't even appear that it's just, hey, public, here's our plan. Isn't it great? Do you have any comments? And So
Right,
they're really incorporating the public, and you are correct about it is it's a TxDOT road, it's Business 77, and I believe they're using safety funds that don't even require local match. But it is a kind of a deal where if there was a big enough argument against it from the city and you didn't want it at all, I'm sure they'd be happy to take the money and use it somewhere else, but,
And I'm not expecting that.
Oh, yeah, exactly,
I know,
but- yeah,
and
but you're
TxDOT's
correct.
here, and they can certainly talk. I recall the last time this was brought up, and there was some strong opposition. I think the public would, it's just me talking, more welcome it now, just because of traffic volume and that section in front of the mall. I can't imagine it without them, frankly, at this point. So I just want to point some of those facts out, and
Well, the evidence is there that, look at all the businesses that have expanded and continue to grow on that, in that quadrant. I don't think it's gonna have an economic deterrent.
As a minor thing, one of the small things that we identified on the MPO, Councilman Alvarez can help me with this, is needing 2 turn lanes if you were heading southbound on Navarro and turning on to 463. Certain times of day it backs up way long, and there are 2 turn lanes if you're westbound on 463 access to turn south on the Navarro. That is an improvement they should make fairly soon, I think. Thought it would be already done, but it isn't, but.
Yeah, nothing's in the works. I'm Paul Wrights with the district office in Yoakum, and kind of to answer your question on as far as the public involvement, this is part of the process. You know, we kind of started with the MPO, made a presentation to them. We wanted to try to present it to the city council to just kind of see what that goes, and then it'll be presented to the public basically through public meetings, any kind of avenue we can. We're going to go to the public to see what kind of support for the project. I mean, we're not going to go forward without any support for it. So this is kind of why we started with the city council. It's just part of our public involvement process. And the question was asked earlier about the limits had changed. Part of that is there's a cost benefit ratio that you kind of look at these projects because they compete statewide for a certain amount of safety money. And for us to do the whole project, the cost benefit would have been kind of high. We didn't feel like it would have been funded, so we kind of trimmed it down. That's why the limits have changed on that project.
Thank you very much.
I have a question. Do you have an idea of what time frame we're looking at after you do your public, public meetings or whatever?
Well, a lot of that will revolve around how much public involvement we have to have. You know, if we have a few public meetings and have a lot of support for it, you know, the project will move a little faster. If we have to do a whole lot more coordination, you know, with different organizations and different businesses, it could add to the time frame. The safety project, they're doing what we call it's a call for them right now, safety projects. It's like a 3-year program. But this, you know, if everything goes right and we have a lot of support and can move forward, you know, this project could be done or started in 18 months. You know, a lot of it's going to kind of revolve around how much public involvement we go through. That'll probably run the timeline on it more than anything else. Because design-wise, it's a fairly simple project to put together. And the funds, you know, the funds actually become available in fiscal year 16.
You know, one of the things I'd like for Bill to answer, safety's the #1 focus on, you know, preventing crashes, and the median do prove that. But another thing too, it helps with that capacity on that road because it avoids conflicts. So would you talk a little bit about, because we hear talk about safety first and then capacity.
Sure. Yeah, and I meant to say that, and I might have got myself in a little bit of a hurry. I'm just going to back up to one of these slides, this one for now. It's a good question. And so the mobility, we have actually tried to research the mobility improvements to get this, quote, empirical data like you can do with crashes, and it's not as easy to do because there's something called microsimulation. You can do a computer model for a segment of roadway, and it kind of depends on a lot of things because some places we've seen big improvements in traffic flow, and in other places we were surprised where the traffic flow stayed about the same, but that's because signal timings changed at some key intersections. But between the intersections, the traffic flowed a lot smoother, and the reason is, I'll just use this word, there's less friction of traffic entering the roadway from that center left turn lane. So if you have fewer points where that can happen, and they're really focused at signalized intersections and other necessary median openings, you have fewer points where you have to slow down or duck over a lane and then come back. Kind of the same way if you think about driving down the right-hand lane of the roadway, every driveway, someone can come out or slow down. Same way, when it's a wide-open raised median, anyone can slow down even at the last minute and move over into that two-way left turn lane, causing you to have to slow down or sometimes move over a lane, and same with them entering. So that's where you get the biggest mobility benefit. And so what that does is, I mentioned earlier, like recapturing some of your capacity. Every roadway has a certain capacity, number of vehicles it can carry per hour per lane. And so anything you can do to minimize slowing down vehicles, you can move more through, so you've regained capacity of that roadway. Does that help
It
answer?
does.
Okay.
And I can say this, in addition to Mr. Alvarez and Mr. Halapasco being on the MPO, I sit on the MPO, Lynn Short sits on the MPO, and this was a project that the MPO did support, but internally, staff also supports, for the safety reasons, the median continuing down Navarro, so but we also recognize it's very political, so, but we do support it.
On the Ben Wilson discussion, where is that at? But that's not TxDOT. I know.
No, we're looking at a consultant, and I think that's going on as I speak, looking for a consultant to look at that project. But we will be, I'm not sure who, Mary, do you have can you give me an update on time on that? I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, we have the RFP out at the moment, so we'll be getting proposals back on July 1st, and it'll go out to the review committee at that point, and then we'll be selecting within a couple weeks after that. And so then it'll just be a matter of getting the contract, the scope of work, everything defined, and moving forward from there.
And that's an MPO project that we're looking at, Ben Wilson near University of Houston, Victoria, as they build those dorms, east of the university. So that would be a divided road and pedestrian friendly with safe islands and all, so.
Okay. Very good. Council, are there any other questions or comments? Thank you, Mr. Frawley.
Thank you.
No, we're good.
Nothing else. We're adjourned.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for everyone's patience.
We're adjourned.